Hello and welcome to this month's Rights in Russia interview. It is March 7th, 2024, and our guest today is Dr. Konstantin Sonin, a Russia-born economist at the University of Chicago. Born in Moscow, he received his Master of Science in 1995 and his doctorate in mathematics from the Faculty of Mechanics and Mathematics at Moscow State University in 1998. After a fellowship year at Harvard University's Davis Center for Russian Studies, 2001, he joined the New Economics School in Moscow, where he became a full professor in 2009 and a vice rector 2011. He has had visiting appointments at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton, 2004 to 5, and the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University, 2009 to 10. In 2013, he joined the Higher School of Economics University, one of the largest universities in Russia, as professor and vice president. Since 2015, Sonin has been a full professor at the University of Chicago in the Harris School, where he was named the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor. He has written in leading political science and economics journals, published a book on economics for a wide audience, contributed to major international and Russian media outlets, and frequently comments on social media. In 2023, Dr. Sonin was placed on Russia's federal wanted list, a criminal case based on information he published in 2022 about the Bucha massacre and the siege of Mariupol. Welcome to Rights in Russia, Dr. Sonin. Such a pleasure to have you here.
It's nice to meet you, Mayor.
Yes. I'd like to hear more about what led you to transition from mathematics to economics. Was this an unusual move?
Oh, I don't know how usual it was, but from when I was a kid in the Soviet Union, I wanted to study history, but I wanted to study what I called myself like the modern history of political history of what is happening right now. I didn't know the words political economy or political science at the time, and whatever there was an economy or political science in the Soviet Union, it was something completely unattractive. So as I would say, all talented kids in the Soviet Union, I was selected into mathematical school. I went into the mathematics department at the Moscow State University. I was extremely lucky with this because this was the first year almost in 20 years when the Moscow State University admitted Jewish students. I'm not actually Jewish, but I have Jewish blood. And in the Soviet Union, they discriminated against people with Jewish blood at the mathematics departments. But I was lucky, so I was studying mathematics and mathematics exclusively. But my plan was to be a political economist all along. So when I got my PhD, I started to work. I also got a master's degree from the New Economics School of Economics, but I started immediately to work as a political economist.
Mm-hmm. And from the point of view of the Russian economy, it seemed at first that the Ukraine invasion was a wholly destructive move, right? But that economy may be surviving despite damage caused by the current sanctions. What are some of the reasons for that? And could there have been any economic reasoning behind Putin's war against Ukraine?
Okay, first, I think that when Putin launched his criminal war against Ukraine in 2022, there was like a lot of hopes, not like based on some analytical perceptions, but because we are human beings, that this suffering should stop very soon. So a lot of economics commentary about the collapse of the impending collapse of the Russian economy because of sanctions, because of the war, because of the isolation, they were driven by this human desire to expect the ending of the bombing of Ukrainian civilians, deaths on occupied territories, things like this. But it was analytically, it was not warranted. Economies do not stop working because of sanctions. So this is hardship. This is bad for Russian people. This is bad for Russian business. This is good, of course, for those who work in weapons productions and to corrupt Putin's friends. But in general, Russian population suffer, but suffering does not collapse the economy. So although I think that 95% of Russians would say that they're worse off as a result of the war, economically. This is far away from saying that there is some impending collapse, whatever a collapse of the economy is.
Mhm.
So answering your question about the economic reasons, now I do not think. I think that basically, I do not think that there were any economic reasons to invade Ukraine. So this was, I think, explained basically by a combination of historical Russian imperial traditions, like there is always this slice of population that has imperial dreams, and like total dysfunction of the Putin's corrupt regime. I mean, like a working state keeps the crazy imperialists in check, and the Putin's government did not. It was taken over by Putin himself, who is like an extreme ideologist, and they did this ultimately criminal but purely ideological driven thing of invading Ukraine.
Mhm. So I have a question now about the death of jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny. How do you interpret what happened and why it happened now?
Okay, I need to say this is like a tragedy for all of us. I was not a close friend with Navalny, but we communicated over 20 years, met regularly. Last time I exchanged messages with him was when in the fall 2021, when I was spending a year in Moscow. He was already in jail, and we discussed a substantive economic issue. He was, I mean, he was a great politician, but he was also infinitely interested in things intellectually. He was like learning every time. He was probing, he was asking questions, we were discussing these issues. His death is an enormous tragedy. I'm pretty sure that he was killed in jail on Putin's orders. We know for sure because of the investigative journalist's work that Putin ordered his killing in 2020 when he was poisoned in Omsk. Since then, we do not know the exact details who killed Navalny in jail now, but the whole pattern that he was moved, that he was actually tortured in jail, he was daily humiliated, they forced him to be photographed naked every day, they put him in a punishment cell, they kept him in inhumane conditions, then they moved him to the north, they moved him to a place in which there were no access of lawyers or human rights activists. They jailed his lawyers. Most of his lawyers are in jail now. Some of them are in exile. So they did all these things. And this was done under constant watch of Putin's administration and people from his security services. So I think it's a very solid evidence. If Putin would be put in a court of law, then he would be charged and I think convicted as a person who ordered this killing.
Mhm. Given that the upcoming elections in Russia will be far from free and fair, so why does the regime still go ahead with them? Will they be in any sense at all a test of Putin's popularity?
Oh, I do not think that this is a test at all of Putin's popularity. I think the main test, like the real test of Putin's popularity, is that everyone who says something bad about Putin goes to jail or fined. Tens of thousands of people who said critical things are exiled abroad. This is a test of Putin's popularity, and he is unpopular. He would not order to kill Navalny if he were popular, obviously. So I mean, that's a question why they still have elections. I need to say that almost 50 years ago, when I was a kid, like 45 years ago, when I was 7 years old, I was asking my parents the same question. Why do we have elections in the Soviet Union? In the Soviet Union, in every electoral districts, we always had a single candidate. This single candidate was always reported to get the 99% turnout and 99% 99% vote for this candidate. So how did it make sense for a 7-year-old? It did not make sense at all. Why it's called elections? In Russian, elections, выборы, means a choice. What was a choice with one candidate? Okay, that's a big question for political scientists. why authoritarian regimes keep pretending that they have elections. That's somehow important for them. I think it might be that Putin wants to maintain this fantasy that he's popular for himself.
Going back to an economics perspective now, when Putin began his first term in office in 2000, many people considered that he was something of an economic liberal. Although already in 2003, we saw the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Now, 24 years later, how does the Russian economy measure up in terms of liberalism? And what about inequality?
Okay, first, Putin was appointed, he was at least a candidate, he was first appointed as acting president, then he was supported by the liberal wing. Also, he was supported by the incumbent president, outgoing President Yeltsin, who was extremely unpopular at the time. After a decade of hardship, Yeltsin was extremely unpopular. So Putin's liberalism early on, his reforms, his early absence of corruption in the first years, this was because he was unpopular. He needed to do something to get economy going. So basically, once they got this, once they had oil prices rising, this was all, they become corrupt, they become stealing money, they become pouring a huge amount of money into state enterprises, nationalized enterprises. They spent, I don't know, a huge chunk of the Russian wealth on weapons that then were used to attack Ukraine. So then it got in the other direction.
If you could say something about inequality.
The Soviet Union was not a very equal society. And in a sense, the equality of the Soviet Union was basically the equality in poverty. So the elite was living a very different life from the common folks in the Soviet Union. At the same time, they were not living like in luxury by modern standards. Then the coming of markets, basically monetization of your privileges, created an extremely rich class. I mean, half of the European billionaires are Russian, and typically by now, some Russian state bureaucrats, middle level or top level. So basically, every single Putin's friend, even people who are dismally bad at their job, they become multimillionaires or billionaires on their job, like people, generals, people in the security services, people who are just his friends, they all got extremely rich during his years of power. So the elite in Russia has become obscenely rich in the Putin years. Then the upper middle class, say 10 million people more, also are relatively rich and relatively well-to-do compared to Western Europe. Still, there is tens of millions of people who are very poor.
Thinking about your academic career, you had a very successful one in Russia until December 2014. You were a vice rector at the prestigious Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And so I want to ask you now about the interaction between the government and academia in Russia and how that relationship might differ from that in the US.
Okay, in Russia, as in many countries, whatever is related to academia, science, or education, it's all state controlled. Basically, in Russia, it's impossible to have a private university or a private research institute on any significant scale. So before joining HEC University, which is a huge university and the top university in Russia in the 21st century, I was at the New Economic School, which was a very small private school. It's like a long-standing economics department but there were huge limits to possible expansion. So it was possible to have these new places of growth instead of reforming the obsolete Russian science. There were like emergence of new institutions in those places in which the Soviet Union was lagging behind, sometimes decades behind the frontiers of modern knowledge, but it was very small. So the HEC University was as new as the New Economic School. It was founded in 1992, but it was a huge state project. Eventually, it has become a huge state project. It started like a small state initiative. Eventually, it became one of the largest universities in Russia. But like in the Fed years, when there were a lot of money, people, reform-oriented people, like the HEC University rector Yaroslav Kuzminov, they used this state legislature to just jumpstart whole new departments, to invite people who got education in the best universities abroad. And then, of course, this all collapsed because the war led to immigration of hundreds of scientists. It basically destroyed this. It brought the social sciences back to the obsolete place it was back 30 years ago.
Last year, you were designated a foreign agent. A great many human rights organizations and activists we know have been branded as foreign agents, as well as media professionals and even some writers like Boris Akunin. But why an economist? And what exactly has this designation meant for you?
Okay, this is totally crazy. So basically, the idea, like, if you look what Putin says, what his henchmen say about the foreign agents, they try to limit the influence of foreign countries in their country. I was made a foreign agent living in the United States, working in the United States University at the University of Chicago. So what sense does it make to designate a person who lives in a foreign land, receives foreign money, and does whatever they do there? It's like, it's beyond comprehension. Like, I could imagine someone who is, for example, works in the Russian government and receive financing from, I don't know, CIA. This would be a foreign agent, but you need to be in Russia for that, right? So I think that this foreign agents law, it does not make any sense from the standpoint of logic or law. It's also, of course, against the text of the Russian constitution, if it matters. But I think this is just another tool to silence people who are critical of the Putin's regime. So to force foreign organizations, human rights organizations out of the country, to force people out of the country, to silence people. I mean, what happens to Boris Akunin? Boris Akunin is now on a far more dangerous list. He is designated as terrorist and extremist. This means his all financial accounts blocked. He will be, I think, arrested and prosecuted for, I mean, terrorism and extremism are extremely high crimes. And Boris Akunin is one of the largest, if not the largest, literary writer of the last half a century in Russia. He is, like, in future textbooks will be Pushkin, Tolstoy, I don't know, Bunin, Sholokhov, Alexeyevich, Akunin, maybe. I mean, he's a huge figure, and they're using these tools just because they want to silence Putin's critics.
So more recently, you've been placed on Russia's federal wanted list on charges of spreading fake news about the Russian army under a law Putin signed following the Ukraine invasion. We know that a growing number of Russians are in prison on this charge, or the similar one of discrediting the Russian army. Indeed, last week, the human rights defender Oleg Orlov was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison on that charge. What impact has the case against you had on you personally? And how would you assess the general impact on Russian citizens of these new laws?
Okay, again, this is totally illegal according to Russian laws, constitution. All these articles, all these prosecutions are totally illegal, and people who do these cases, who put Ilya Yashin or Oleg Orlov in jail, those who sentence Dmitry Gluchovsky, those who prosecute me, they are criminals. They will be eventually prosecuted as Nazi criminals were prosecuted for their crimes. I mean, personally, there is a joke in absentia. They could even shoot me. Whatever they do, I cannot travel to Russia. I probably should be watchful of whether I travel to Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan, or I don't know, those countries that could use the federal wanted list against me. That's basically it. Perhaps this also puts people in Russia or people going to Russia who communicate with me in danger. But beyond that, I don't think there are any consequences.
Mhm. And for ordinary citizens, do these new laws, I mean, do they impact them?
People are, of course, like that's the way Putin keeps his power, is that there are a lot of criminal cases. You say something on social media, even if this is completely true. I mean, what I wrote about Bucha and Mariupol was basically reports of the human rights agencies and the United Nations report, the New York Times, extremely thorough, extremely detailed investigation of the atrocities that were committed by Russian troops. So this is what I'm saying, that there was no exclusivity in my information. It was like run-of-the-mill standard information about these things. But if a person in Russia puts this on their social media, then they're in immediate danger and people go to jail, people get fined. And this is how Putin keeps power. The fear is basically the main his main instrument.
Mhm. And looking back over these years of the Putin regime, should we see the gradual reduction in civil liberties and the erosion of democracy as the implementation of some great plan, or has it been more a question of ad hoc adaptations to events by the regime?
I think it's more like a collapse of the modern state. So basically, when Putin came to power, Russia was in a difficult economic situation, but there was a functioning state. So people in the government, they were accountable to politicians who were elected. They were far less corrupt. Nowadays, it's just Putin, his friends, corruption, and they use government institution, police, security services, the army for their own goals, not for the state interests. So for now, it's like normal for a minister, for a general, for a chief of police to fulfill Putin's personal wishes rather than to do what the constitution and the law dictates to them. So I think this is basically the way Putin accumulated power, is by destroying the normal functioning of the state.
Mhm. And that was done.
This was happening gradually over the years. Basically,
Mhm.
I mean, it's done, meaning that like you see a criminal who dismantles the institution. So what is done, it's not a project of building something. It's basically the project of gradual destruction. Whatever limited him, we would like, these people criticize me, we would put this law in place. These people publish information about corruption of my generals. Okay, we will block access to information. We will remove other channels of accountability. So, like, if I'm not popular, my party is not popular, okay, we will do election falsification. When election falsifications of the old sorts do not work. We'll do electronic voting, and we will just draw numbers. They're no longer related to what people do. This is just not like ballot harvesting. This is just outright falsification. So basically, this is like a 25 years long project of dismantling the state institutions.
Right. So this year Putin will be 72 years old. And so as an economist, but also as someone with insights into politics, and not least as a citizen, how do you see the regime that he has built continuing in the coming years? And how will it transform when he leaves the scene?
Okay, I think the transformation will be disruptive, not necessarily accompanied by huge mass uprising, but I do not think that the regime will stand when Putin is gone. The current regime is highly personalized, and I'm pretty sure that when he dies, I hope sooner, or gets arrested, deported, or removed by force, then it will be a huge improvement. Like the death of Stalin was a huge improvement for Russian people. Not only, I mean, 1 million people returned from the concentration camps when Stalin died, but also the growth rates, they were basically tripled in 2 years. So after 7 years of post-war stagnations under Stalin, there was a high growth rates even in the initial post-Stalin years. That was sort of funny. When Stalin died, his magnates, his former henchmen, and now the new powers, they were keeping fighting each other, and some of them were executed as a result of this fighting, and some of them were forced out of power. But the country was living much better. They were fighting. Bulganin was replacing Malenkov, Khrushchev was replacing Bulganin. There were some other no-names, some strong figures, some no-names among them, but the whole country was breathing much easier. People were living better. Actually, economy was started to grow when Stalin died. So the same thing when Putin dies. I think there will be a lot of internal infighting, but this will be exactly, it will be better for Ukraine, because I think whoever comes after Putin will start negotiating the withdrawal of the troops and compensation to Ukraine. And this will be better to Russian people, because they will breathe easier.
Well, that's a good sort of halfway optimistic note to end on here. And this has been a wonderful discussion. We are grateful for your time, and thank you for sharing your insights, and particularly your economic perspective, which we don't often get in Rights in Russia. So that's been terrific. We wish you well as you continue your research and teaching at the University of Chicago, and perhaps we will see you again on Rights in Russia. We hope so.
Thank you. Thank you very much.